The room fell silent the moment the heart monitor changed its rhythm. Every pair of eyes turned toward the operating suite doors as military security officers rushed through the hallway. Nurses stepped aside. Doctors stopped their conversations. No one needed an explanation. Someone important had arrived. Within seconds, the answer spread through the hospital. A 4-star general had collapsed during a classified defense briefing. The emergency department moved with practice speed, but the atmosphere felt different. This was not just another emergency patient. Every decision suddenly carried enormous weight. General Aldrin Holt lay unconscious on the trauma bed as physicians surrounded him. His breathing was uneven. His pulse drifted between steady and dangerously weak. Blood pressure is dropping. Get another scan. Call cardiology. The voices overlapped while machines beeped steadily around them. Standing quietly near the foot of the bed was combat nurse Leora Vance. She had transferred to the military medical center only 3 weeks earlier after nearly a decade serving in overseas combat zones. Unlike many around her, she did not rush to speak. She simply watched. Years of battlefield medicine had taught her something valuable. The body often whispered before it screamed. As another physician adjusted the oxygen mask, Leora noticed the general's left hand twitch slightly. His breathing paused for just a fraction longer than expected. Then his shoulders tightened. It lasted barely 2 seconds. Most people never would have noticed. She did. The emergency physician looked toward the scans appearing on the monitor. Possible cardiac complication, he said. We need surgery immediately. Another doctor nodded. I agree. Within minutes, hospital administrators filled the hallway. Phones rang nonstop. Military officials arrived with sealed folders and worried expressions. One administrator lowered his voice. Has Dr. Corwin been contacted? Already on his way. Relief spread across several faces. Dr. Gideon Corwin was considered one of the country's finest military surgeons. He had led countless difficult operations and published research used in hospitals across the nation. Whenever a high-profile patient needed surgery, his name was always first. One nurse quietly smiled. If anyone can save him, it's Dr. Corwin. Leora remained silent. She looked once more at the monitor. Something still felt wrong. Not wrong enough to prove, just wrong enough to bother her. Nearly 20 minutes later, the operating room was being prepared. Sterile instruments lined the tables. Surgical lights glowed overhead. Dr. Corwin entered without hesitation, removing his coat as assistants updated him. Male, 63, sudden collapse. Suspected cardiac emergency. Blood pressure unstable. He studied the scans. His expression remained calm. We proceed immediately. The staff moved faster. Leora joined the operating team, checking medications while another nurse organized supplies. She glanced again at the latest imaging. Then she froze. A tiny shadow near one major vessel, barely visible. She leaned closer. Her heartbeat slowed. She had seen something similar once before. Not in a hospital. In a combat tent halfway across the world, after an armored vehicle struck an improvised explosive device. The injured soldier had looked stable at first. Then everything changed. The memory returned with surprising clarity. Not because of the wound, because almost everyone had nearly missed it. Leora quietly enlarged one section of the scan. The same unusual pattern. Small, easy to overlook, potentially deadly. She turned toward another nurse. Can you look at this? The nurse studied the image. I don't really see anything. It may not be cardiac. The nurse frowned. What do you mean? Leora chose her words carefully. It reminds me of delayed trauma. The nurse blinked. But he collapsed today. I know. He hasn't been in combat for years. Leora nodded. I know. Before either could continue, Dr. Corwin approached. Everything ready? Yes, doctor. Leora hesitated. She respected experience. She respected rank. But she respected patience even more. Doctor? He looked at her. Yes. She pointed toward the scan. I think there may be another possibility. He stepped closer. What possibility? I've seen something similar after blast injuries. He glanced briefly at the image before returning his attention to the chart. This isn't a battlefield injury. No, sir. The scans support the diagnosis. I understand. He offered a polite smile. I appreciate the observation. Then he turned away. We're proceeding. No anger, no insult, just certainty. The room returned to work. Leora said nothing else. She checked surgical instruments one more time, yet the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. Across the room, one of the younger surgical residents noticed her expression. You still think something's off? She answered quietly, I hope I'm wrong. The resident folded his arms. You sound pretty sure. Leora stared toward the unconscious general. In combat, she said softly, the cases that worry me most are the ones that looked ordinary. The resident didn't answer. Neither did she. Outside the operating room, military officers gathered behind the glass windows. One officer removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. Another checked his watch every few seconds. Nobody spoke much. Inside, anesthesia preparations began. Monitors connected. For lines checked, the room settled into its familiar rhythm before surgery. Dr. Corwin reviewed the final plan. Everyone ready? Heads nodded around the room. Leora watched the general's face. His breathing changed again, almost too subtle to notice. Then the monitor displayed another brief pattern, exactly like before. Her stomach tightened. She leaned slightly toward the resident beside her. If we're treating the wrong problem. He looked at her. She finished in almost a whisper. He won't survive the first 10 minutes. The resident's eyes widened just as Dr. Corwin reached for the first surgical instrument. The first few minutes looked exactly as everyone expected, until they didn't. Inside the operating room, every movement followed a familiar rhythm. Surgical instruments passed from hand to hand without hesitation. The anesthesia team monitored every change in the general's condition while Dr. Gideon Corwin worked with calm precision. General Aldrin Holt's vital signs held steady at first. Then one monitor gave a sharp alert. His blood pressure dropped. The anesthesiologist looked up, pressures falling. Dr. Corwin didn't panic. Increase fluids. The team responded immediately. For a moment, the numbers improved. Then they slipped again. Another alarm sounded. Heart rate is becoming irregular. Leora Vance kept her eyes on every screen instead of the surgical field. She had learned long ago that machines often revealed the story before the patient did. Something still didn't fit. Dr. Corwin continued carefully. I don't see anything here that explains this much instability. One of the assistants adjusted a light. Another checked the latest lab results. Everything pointed toward the diagnosis they had expected. Everything except the patient. Leora noticed another brief change in the monitor. It wasn't dramatic. It lasted barely a second before disappearing. She leaned slightly closer. There was again a pattern, not random, not electrical interference. A pattern she remembered from years earlier. The memory returned without warning. A young service member had been carried into a temporary combat hospital after surviving a powerful roadside explosion. There had been almost no visible injuries. The scans looked reassuring. Several doctors believed he simply needed observation, but the veteran trauma nurse who had trained Leora had refused to relax. She had pointed toward nearly invisible changes on the monitor. They're small, the older nurse had whispered, but they're telling us something. Hours later, they had discovered a hidden internal injury that almost claimed the soldier's life. The lesson had stayed with Leora ever since. Never ignore a pattern simply because it doesn't match expectations. Back in the operating room, another alarm interrupted her thoughts. Pressures dropping again. The anesthesiologist frowned. This isn't responding the way it should. Dr. Corwin paused for only a moment before continuing. We stay focused. Leora looked from the monitor to the imaging displayed on the wall, then back again. She took one careful breath. Doctor. He looked toward her without stopping his work. Yes. I think we're seeing delayed pressure changes from something deeper. One of the senior physicians answered before Dr. Corwin could. We've already reviewed that possibility. Leora remained calm. I understand. The scans are clear. They may not be. The room grew quiet for a second. The senior physician shook his head. We're losing valuable time. Leora didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer to the monitor. May I show you something? Dr. Corwin studied her face. She wasn't speaking with panic. She wasn't trying to challenge him. She genuinely believed she had seen something. He gave a short nod. Make it quick. Leora pointed toward the monitor history. This change appears every time his blood pressure falls. The resident standing nearby leaned forward. I didn't notice that. She continued. Neither did I at first. Dr. Cohen looked carefully. The pattern repeated. Small, easy to dismiss. But real. What does it suggest? He asked. Leora answered quietly. A hidden pressure source. The senior physician folded his arms. Based on what evidence? My experience. The answer filled the room with silence. Experience alone rarely changed surgical plans. But confidence born from experience was harder to ignore. The resident spoke carefully. She's not guessing. Everyone turned toward him. I reviewed her service file yesterday. The senior physician looked surprised. You did? I was curious. And the resident swallowed. She served on multiple forward surgical teams. Another nurse added softly, I heard she spent years treating blast casualties. Leora wished the conversation would end. She had never liked discussing her past. The operating room was not the place for stories. It was a place for decisions. Another alarm interrupted everyone. The blood pressure fell even lower. The anesthesiologist looked directly at Dr. Corwin. We're running out of options if this continues. Dr. Corwin stared at the monitor, then at the scan, then back at Leora. What exactly would you do? Every face in the room turned toward her. She answered without rushing. I would stop assuming this is only a cardiac event. She pointed toward the image she had noticed earlier. I'd examine this area first. The senior physician frowned. That shadow? Yes. It's almost invisible. I know. It could be an imaging artifact. It could... Dr. Corwin remained silent. Leora continued. If it's what I think it is, we'll keep chasing symptoms instead of the cause. The resident looked at the surgeon. She's making sense. The room waited. Outside the operating suite, military officials watched through the observation window. None of them could hear the conversation. They only saw the surgical team standing still. One officer whispered, "Why have they stopped?" No one answered. Inside, seconds felt unusually long. Dr. Corwin finally spoke. "If you're wrong..." Leora nodded. "I understand. We lose precious time." "Yes. And if you're right?" She met his eyes. "We may still have time." He studied her expression. There was no fear, no pride, only quiet certainty. He made his decision. "Show me." The room came alive again. Leora moved beside the imaging display and carefully explained what caught her attention. She didn't speak like someone trying to impress anyone. She spoke like someone who had seen people die because tiny details were ignored. Dr. Corwin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked back toward the patient, then toward the surgical field. He slowly changed position, adjusted the exposure. The assistants obeyed immediately. Another light shifted into place. The room became almost perfectly silent. Dr. Corwin examined the area Leora had identified. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. No one breathed comfortably. Suddenly his expression changed. He leaned closer. "Hold on." The words barely left his mouth. He looked at Leora, then back at the patient. His voice became calm, but unmistakably different. "I think." He reached carefully toward the hidden area. "You may have found something." Dr. Gideon Corwin stopped moving for just a second, and in an operating room, a single second could feel like forever. The tiny abnormality Leora Vance had pointed out was real. It was almost hidden beneath surrounding tissue, easy to mistake for a harmless shadow on the scans. But now that the surgical field had been adjusted, Dr. Corwin could clearly see that something wasn't right. He looked toward the imaging screen once more, then back at Leora. "You've seen this before?" She nodded once, only twice. And both times, it wasn't the heart that failed first. The room fell quiet. Dr. Corwin inhaled slowly before making a decision. We're changing the plan. No one argued. The senior physician who had questioned Leora earlier simply stepped back and allowed the team to reposition equipment. This was no longer about pride. It was about giving the patient every possible chance. New instruments, Dr. Corwin said. The scrub nurse immediately handed them over. Leora moved closer to the monitors, watching every number. She called out each change calmly. Pressure is holding. Heart rate is steady for now. The anesthesiologist glanced toward her. Better than 5 minutes ago. It wasn't a victory, but it was hope. Dr. Corwin worked carefully around the area Leora had identified. Every movement became slower and more deliberate. There it is, he said quietly. The resident leaned closer. I almost missed it. So did I, Dr. Corwin admitted. The hidden complication had likely been developing for years. It traced back to an injury the general had suffered decades earlier during military service. At the time, doctors had treated the obvious wounds, and he had recovered well enough to continue his career. But the body sometimes remembered injuries long after people forgot them. A tiny weakness had remained unnoticed. Now it had become life-threatening. Leora watched the monitor again. The pattern she had recognized was beginning to disappear. She allowed herself one slow breath. Not relief, just cautious optimism. The resident looked toward her. Where did you learn to notice something like that? She didn't answer immediately. Her attention stayed on the patient. Finally, she spoke. In places where we didn't get a second chance. The words brought back memories she rarely shared. Years earlier, she had worked inside a temporary surgical shelter near an active conflict zone. Helicopters arrived day and night, carrying injured service members. There were no perfect conditions, no advanced imaging, and rarely enough time. Every decision depended on observation. Every heartbeat mattered. One evening, a young communications officer had been brought in after an explosion. He insisted he felt fine, except for shoulder pain. Several people believed he could wait. Leora had noticed tiny changes in his breathing, almost invisible. She remembered telling the lead medic, "Something's hiding." The medic trusted her instincts. Minutes later, they discovered a serious internal injury. The officer survived. That experience became part of her forever. Back in the present, another alert sounded. This time it came from the heart monitor. The rhythm suddenly became irregular. The anesthesiologist reacted first. We got an arrhythmia. Blood pressure dipped again. Not as severely as before, but enough to change the mood inside the room. Dr. Corwin didn't look away from his work. Medication. The anesthesiologist nodded, already giving it. Leora watched every number. Heart rate is responding. For several tense moments, no one spoke. Only the sounds of equipment filled the room. Then everything changed. A long tone echoed through the operating room. The heart rhythm flattened. He's lost electrical activity. The anesthesiologist immediately began emergency protocols. Dr. Corwin stayed remarkably calm. No one panicked. Leora moved without hesitation. She confirmed each step as the team worked together. The resident followed her instructions before anyone else repeated them. The room had become one unit. No titles, no egos, only professionals focused on one life. Medication in, compression support ready, monitoring. Seconds stretched endlessly. Outside the operating room, officers waiting behind the glass noticed unusual movement inside. One quietly whispered, "Something's wrong." No one answered. Inside, every face remained focused. Dr. Corwin spoke firmly. "We're not stopping." Leora watched the monitor. Nothing. Another moment passed. Still nothing. She looked toward Dr. Corwin. "Our timing is good." He understood what she meant. The hidden complication had been addressed. Now the heart needed a reason to begin again. The anesthesiologist administered another medication. Everyone waited. The monitor remained silent. The resident looked down. Leora noticed the uncertainty in his eyes. She spoke calmly. "Stay with the process." He nodded. A few more seconds passed. Then a single heartbeat appeared. One tiny movement across the screen. Nobody celebrated. Another beat followed. Then another. The rhythm slowly returned. The long tone disappeared. Normal monitor sounds filled the room once again. Several members of the surgical team quietly released breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. The anesthesiologist smiled for the first time. "We've got him back." Dr. Corwin never looked away from the patient. "We're not finished." He was right. The operation still required careful repair before the danger truly passed. For nearly another hour, surgeon and combat nurse worked together, without unnecessary conversation. Whenever Dr. Corwin requested information, Leora already had it. Whenever the monitors shifted, she noticed immediately. Their experience complemented each other in a way neither had expected. The senior physician who had doubted her earlier watched silently. Finally, he stepped beside the resident. "I've practiced medicine for 25 years, he said quietly. "I almost dismissed the person who saved this operation." The resident answered without taking his eyes off the patient. So did everyone else. As the final repair was completed, Dr. Corwin slowly lowered his shoulders. The immediate danger is over. Relief spread across the room, but only briefly. The anesthesiologist reviewed the latest readings. His expression became serious again. The surgery was successful. Everyone looked toward him. He continued carefully. "But we won't know whether General Holt suffered brain damage until he wakes up." The room grew silent once more as the unconscious general was prepared for transfer to intensive care, leaving one question hanging over everyone involved. Would the man they had fought so hard to save ever open his eyes again? No one in the intensive care unit dared to celebrate. The surgery had ended successfully, but General Aldrin Holt remained unconscious. Machines now did the quiet work of watching every heartbeat, every breath, every small change that might signal recovery or something far more difficult. Outside his room, military officers waited with remarkable patience. Some had been there through the entire night. Others had arrived before sunrise after hearing what had happened. The hospital itself felt unusually still. People spoke in softer voices. Every update traveled through the building within minutes. Dr. Gideon Corwin stood outside the intensive care room, reading the latest reports. The operation had repaired the hidden injury, but recovery would depend on how the general's brain responded after the loss of circulation during surgery. One of the neurologists joined him. "The next 24 hours are important." Dr. Corwin nodded. "I know. We've seen encouraging signs, but no guarantees." "Not yet." A few feet away, Leora Vance quietly finished documenting the surgery. Her report was simple and factual. It contained no mention of the moments when she had challenged the original diagnosis. She listed observations, actions, times, nothing more. The younger resident noticed. "You didn't include that you recognized the complication first." She looked up from the chart. "The report isn't about me. It should be." "No." He frowned. "It changed everything." She offered a small smile. "The patient is what matters." The resident had heard those words before from experienced nurses, but somehow they sounded different coming from Leora. She meant every syllable. Later that morning, hospital leadership gathered in a conference room overlooking the medical wing. The chief medical officer opened the meeting. "Because this involves a senior military leader, we'll conduct a routine review of yesterday's operation." No one objected. Complicated surgeries were often reviewed, especially when treatment plans changed unexpectedly. A senior administrator asked the first question: "Who made the decision to alter the surgical approach?" Several people looked toward Dr. Corwin. He answered without hesitation: "I did." Another administrator nodded. "What caused the change?" Dr. Corwin didn't pause. Combat nurse Leora Vance identified findings that I initially underestimated. The room became quiet. Someone looked down at the written timeline. "So the revised procedure came from her observation?" "Yes." "Were you convinced immediately?" "No." The honesty surprised several people. Dr. Corwin folded his hands. "I believe the original diagnosis was correct. And then I listened." The room remained silent. He continued, "I've spent my career teaching surgeons never to ignore evidence." He looked toward the window before finishing. "Yesterday I almost ignored it because it came from someone with fewer titles." No one challenged the statement. Across the hospital, Word of the conversation spread faster than anyone expected. Doctors who had not been inside the operating room began asking about Leora. Some assumed she must have been a famous trauma specialist. Others believed she had published groundbreaking research. Instead, they found a surprisingly thin personnel file. Very little about awards. Almost nothing about recognition. The only thing that stood out was years of overseas service with forward surgical teams. The resident visited the military archives office during his lunch break. He returned carrying several declassified service summaries. One nurse looked over his shoulder. "What did you find?" He read quietly. "Multiple deployments." Another page. "Emergency battlefield surgical support." Another. "Mass casualty response." He stopped reading. "There are dozens of commendations." The nurse blinked. "I've never heard of her." Neither had I. Most of the awards weren't public. Many missions remained classified. The file never described dramatic rescues, only brief sentences. Provided emergency treatment under hostile conditions. Stabilized multiple wounded personnel. Continued medical operations despite limited resources. The simple language somehow made the stories feel even more remarkable. That afternoon, the senior physician who had questioned Leora before surgery found her organizing supplies for another patient. She looked up. "Can I help you?" He hesitated. "I owe you an apology." She seemed surprised. "For what?" "I dismiss your opinion." She gently closed the supply cabinet. "You were protecting your patient. I was protecting my assumptions." Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, he said, "Thank you for speaking anyway." Leora nodded. "I've learned that silence can cost lives." He left without another word. The lesson stayed with him long after he walked away. As evening approached, more encouraging signs appeared in General Holt's condition. His breathing became stronger. His neurological responses improved slightly. The nurses exchanged hopeful looks, but remained careful not to promise anything. Recovery often moved one step forward and one step back. Late that night, Dr. Corwin entered the intensive care room alone. He stood quietly beside the bed. For the first time in years, he questioned how easily experience could become confidence, and how confidence could become blindness. He looked at the unconscious general, then toward the hallway where Leora was finishing another shift. He knew something had changed inside him, not because he had been wrong. Every doctor eventually faced that reality. What mattered was recognizing it before it became too late. Just after sunrise, the heart monitor showed a small increase in activity. The bedside nurse leaned closer. Dr. Corwin hurried into the room. General Holt's fingers moved. Barely. Then his eyelids twitched. Another nurse called for the neurologist. The room filled quietly with medical staff. Seconds later, the general slowly opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first. The neurologist spoke calmly. "General Holt, can you hear me?" A slow blink. Then another. His eyes gradually settled on the faces around him. The breathing tube had already been removed, but his voice came out weak. Everyone leaned closer to hear. Most expected him to ask where he was, or what had happened. Instead, his first word surprised every person in the room. "Who?" He paused to catch his breath. Kept telling everyone. The staff exchanged confused glances. The general swallowed carefully before finishing the question. "Not to give up on me?" The room froze when General Aldrin Holt asked a question no one expected. "Who?" Kept telling everyone not to give up on me. The nurses exchanged puzzled looks. Dr. Gideon Corwin stepped closer to the bed. "General, can you remember hearing voices during the operation?" The general blinked slowly. "Not clearly." He paused, searching through the fog of fading memories. But one voice stayed calm. His breathing remained weak, but his words grew steadier. Someone kept saying, "Stay with us. Keep going. You're not done yet." Silence settled over the room. The intensive care nurse looked toward Leora Vance, who had quietly entered to check the morning medications. She immediately stopped near the doorway. Dr. Corwin smiled gently. "I believe you're talking about Nurse Vance." General Holt turned his head with visible effort. His eyes settled on Leora. "So it was you?" She stepped forward without drawing attention to herself. I was just doing my job, General. A faint smile appeared on his face. No, he shook his head slightly. You were doing much more than that. The neurologist checked his chart before allowing the conversation to continue for another minute. General Holt looked at Leora again. I couldn't see anything. I know. I couldn't move. She nodded, but I heard that voice. Leora lowered her eyes for a moment. In every deployment she had served, she had spoken to unconscious patients. Sometimes they recovered. Sometimes they never opened their eyes again. She had never imagined one of them would remember. A few days later, the general's recovery surprised even his doctors. His strength returned steadily. His memory remained sharp. Most importantly, every neurological test showed encouraging results. One afternoon, he requested a private meeting. Only 3 people were invited: Dr. Corwin, Leora Vance, and himself. The hospital commander quietly closed the conference room door behind them. General Holt sat comfortably beside the window. He looked healthier than he had only days earlier. For several moments, he simply looked at both medical professionals. Then he spoke. I've spent my entire career making decisions about people. Neither interrupted. I've commanded thousands of soldiers. He smiled thoughtfully. The best leaders I ever knew had one thing in common. Dr. Corwin listened carefully. They listened to the quiet voices in the room. The general turned toward the surgeon. Doctor, you could have ignored her. Dr. Corwin nodded. I almost did. But you didn't. No. The surgeon looked directly at Leora. I've replayed that moment many times. He took a slow breath. My reputation nearly became more important than my judgment. Leora answered softly. You changed course when it mattered, because you had the courage to speak. He continued before she could respond. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. You don't owe me anything. I do. He smiled. I spent years teaching young surgeons to stay humble. His smile faded, and somehow I forgot the lesson myself. The room remained quiet. Finally, Leora spoke. I never wanted credit. I know. All I wanted was another chance for the patient. General Holt watched both of them with obvious respect. That's exactly why this conversation matters. Over the next week, news of the operation spread throughout the military medical community. The hospital held its routine quality review. Instead of focusing on mistakes, the discussion centered on teamwork. Doctors talked openly about listening across ranks. Residents asked questions. Nurses shared experiences they had once kept to themselves. The atmosphere slowly changed. One young nurse approached Leora after a training session. I almost stayed quiet during a patient assessment yesterday. Leora looked at her. What happened? I remembered your story. And I spoke up. The young nurse smiled. The doctor checked again. She laughed softly. I was right. Leora smiled back. Keep speaking. Weeks later, General Holt was strong enough to attend a small ceremony inside the hospital auditorium. It wasn't a public event. Only hospital staff, military personnel, and a handful of patients attended. There were no television cameras, no reporters, just people who understood what had happened. The hospital commander introduced General Holt first. The general walked slowly to the podium. He looked around the room before speaking. I've received medals during my career. He paused. I've accepted promotions. Another pause. But none of those moments taught me what I learned inside this hospital. Everyone listened. I learned that leadership isn't about rank. He glanced toward Leora. It's about recognizing wisdom wherever you find it. The audience applauded quietly. He continued. Combat Nurse Leora Vance reminded all of us that experience takes many forms. He smiled warmly. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner sees what everyone else has missed. He invited Leora to join him. She looked almost uncomfortable walking onto the stage. The commander handed the general a small presentation case. Inside rested a military commendation recognizing extraordinary medical service. General Holt presented it himself. You helped save my life. Leora accepted it respectfully. It was a team effort. The audience smiled. That answer sounded exactly like her. After the ceremony, Dozens of people gathered around Dr. Corwin. Several residents thanked him for openly admitting his mistake. One remarked, "It takes confidence to lead." Dr. Corwin shook his head. "It takes even more confidence to listen." Across the room, Leora quietly slipped away before anyone noticed. She returned to the medical floor. A nurse met her in the hallway. "You're leaving already?" "My shift starts in 5 minutes." The nurse laughed. "After everything that's happened?" Leora smiled. "Patients don't stop needing care." She picked up a chart from the nurse's station and walked toward her next room. Inside waited an elderly veteran, recovering from routine surgery. He smiled as she entered. "Good morning." She smiled back. "Good morning. How are you feeling today?" Outside the room, life at the hospital continued as it always had. Stretchers rolled through the halls. Doctors discussed treatment plans. Families waited with hope. Nothing looked extraordinary, yet something had quietly changed. More people listened. More people spoke when something didn't feel right. And somewhere down the hallway, a young resident stopped outside another patient's room, looked once more at a monitor, and remembered a lesson that had saved a 4-star general. Sometimes the smallest voice carries a truth that saves a life.